First Enoch, the Hermeneia translation, George W. E. Nicholsburg and James C. Vanderkam. Chapters 83 through 90, Enoch's Dream Visions. And now, my son Methuselah, I will show you all the visions that I saw. Before you I will recount them. 2 visions I saw before I took a wife, and the one was unlike the other. The first was when I was learning to write, and the second before I took your mother as my wife. I saw a terrible vision, and concerning it I made supplication to the Lord. I was lying down in the house of Mahalalel, my grandfather, when I saw in a vision. Heaven was thrown down and taken away, and it fell down upon the earth. And when it fell upon the earth, I saw how the earth was swallowed up in the great abyss. Mountains were suspended upon mountains, and hills sank down upon hills. Tall trees were cut from their roots, and were thrown away and sank into the abyss. And then speech fell into my mouth, and I lifted up my voice to cry out and said, The earth has been destroyed. And Mahalalel, my grandfather, aroused me, since I was lying near him, and said to me, Why do you cry out so, my son? And why do you lament so? And I recounted to him the whole vision that I had seen, and he said to me, A terrible thing you have seen, my son, and mighty is the vision of your dream in the secrets of all the sin of the earth. It must sink into the abyss, and it will be utterly destroyed. And now, my son, arise, and make supplication to the Lord of glory, since you are faithful, that a remnant may remain upon the earth, and that he may not obliterate the whole earth. My son, from heaven all this will take place on the earth, and on the earth there will be great destruction. Then I arose and prayed, and made supplication and request, and my prayer I wrote down for the generations of eternity. And everything I shall show you, my son Methuselah. And when I went out below, and saw the heaven and the sun rising in the east, and the moon setting in the west, and a few stars, and all the earth and everything as he made it from the beginning. Then I blessed the Lord of judgment, and to him I ascribed majesty, for he made the sun go forth from the windows of the east, so that it ascended and rose on the face of the heaven, and he made it rise, and it traverses the path that it was shown. And I lifted up my hands in righteousness and blessed the great Holy One. And I spoke with the breath of my mouth and with a tongue of flesh, which God has made for the sons of the flesh of man, that they might speak with it. And he has given them breath and tongue and mouth, that they might speak with it. Blessed are you, O Lord, King, great and mighty in your majesty, Lord of all the creation of the heaven, King of kings and God of all eternity. Your power and your reign and your majesty abide forever and forever and ever, and to all generations your dominion. All the heavens are your throne forever, and all the earth is your footstool forever and forever and ever. For you have made and you rule all things, and nothing is too difficult for you. Wisdom does not escape you, and it does not turn away from your throne, nor from your presence. You know and see and hear all things, and there is nothing that is hidden from you. And now the angels of your heavens are doing wrong, and upon human flesh is your wrath until the great day of judgment. And now, O God and Lord, and great King, I make supplication and request that you fulfill my prayer, to leave me a remnant on the earth, and not obliterate all human flesh, and devastate the earth, that there be eternal destruction. And now, my Lord, remove from the earth the flesh that has aroused your wrath, but the righteous and true flesh raise up as a seed-bearing plant forever. And hide not your face from the prayer of your servant, O Lord. After this I saw a second dream, and I will show all of it to you, my son. And Enoch lifted up his voice and said to his son Methuselah, To you I speak, my son. Hear my words, and incline your ear to the dream vision of your father. Before I took your mother Edna as my wife, I saw in a vision on my bed, and look, a bull came forth from the earth, and that bull was white. And after it a young heifer came forth, and with her 2 bull calves came forth. One of them was black, and one was red. And that black calf struck the red one, and pursued it over the earth. And from then on, I could not see that red calf. But that black calf grew up, and a young heifer came to it. And I saw that many cattle came forth from it, that were like it, and were following after it. And that female calf, that first one, went forth from the presence of that first bull. She searched for that red calf, but did not find it. And she lamented bitterly over it and searched for it. And I looked until that first bull came to her and quieted her, and from that time on she did not cry out. After this she bore another white bull, and after it she bore many black bulls and cows. And I saw in my sleep that white bull, that it grew likewise, and became a large white bull. And from it came forth many white cattle, and they were like it. And they began to bear many white cattle, which were like them, and each one followed the other. And again I saw with my eyes as I was sleeping. I saw the heaven above, and look, a star fell from heaven, and it arose, and was eating and pasturing among those cattle. Then I saw those large and black cattle, and look, all of them exchanged their pens, and their pastures, and their calves, and they began to moan, one after the other. And again I saw in the vision, and I looked to heaven, and look, I saw many stars descend and cast themselves down from heaven to that first star. And in the midst of those calves they became bulls, and they were pasturing with them in their midst. I looked at them, and I saw, and look, all of them let out their organs like horses, and they began to mount the cows of the bulls, and they all conceived and bore elephants and camels and asses. And all the bulls feared them and were terrified before them, and they began to bite with their teeth and devour and gore with their horns, and they began to devour those bulls. And look, all the sons of the earth began to tremble and quake before them, and to flee. And again I saw them, and they began to gore one another and devour one another, and the earth began to cry out. And I lifted my eyes again to heaven, and I saw in the vision, and look, there came forth from heaven beings with the appearance of white men. 4 came forth from that place, and 3 with them. And those 3 who came after took hold of me by my hand, and raised me from the generations of the earth, and lifted me onto a high place. And they showed me a tower high above the earth, and all the hills were smaller. And they said to me, Stay here until you see all that happens to those elephants and camels and asses, and to the stars, and to the cattle, and all of them. And I saw one of those four who had come before. He seized that first star that had fallen from heaven, and he bound it by its hands and feet and threw it into an abyss. And that abyss was narrow and deep and desolate and dark. And one of these drew a sword and gave it to those elephants and camels and asses. And they began to strike one another, and the whole earth quaked because of them. And as I looked in the vision, look, one of those four who had come forth hurled stones from heaven and gathered, and took all the great stars whose organs were like the organs of horses, and bound all of them by their hands and their feet, and threw them into an abyss of the earth. And one of those four went to one of the white bulls and taught it a mystery, trembling as it was. It was born a bull, but became a man, and he built himself a vessel, and dwelt in it. And three bulls dwelt with him on that vessel, and the vessel was covered and roofed over them. And again I lifted my eyes toward heaven, and I saw a high roof, and 7 sluices on it. And those sluices were pouring out much water into an enclosure. And I looked again, and look, fissures opened up in the floor in that large enclosure, and that water began to bubble up and rise above the floor. And I was looking at that enclosure until all the floor was covered with water. And water and darkness and mist increased on it, and I kept seeing the height of that water. And that water had risen above that enclosure and was overflowing that enclosure, and stood on the earth. And all the cattle of that enclosure were gathered together until I saw them sinking and being engulfed and perishing in that water. And that vessel was floating on the waters, but all the bulls and elephants and camels and asses sank to the bottom together with every animal, so that I could not see them. And they were unable to escape, but perished and sank in the deep. And again I saw in the vision until those water channels were removed from that high roof, and the fountains of the floor were stopped up, and other abysses were opened, and the water began to descend into them until the floor was uncovered, and that vessel settled onto the floor, and darkness withdrew, and it became light. That white bull who had become a man came out of that vessel, and the 3 bulls with him. And one of those 3 bulls was white like that bull, and one of them was red like blood, and one of them was black. And that white bull departed from them. And they began to beget wild beasts and birds, so that there arose from them every kind of species: lions, leopards, wolves, dogs, hyenas, wild boars, foxes, conies, pigs, falcons, vultures, kites, eagles, and ravens. But among them a white bull was born, and they began to bite one another. But that white bull that was born among them begot a wild ass, and a white bull with it, and the wild asses increased. But that bull that was born from it begot a black wild boar, and a white ram of the flock. And that wild boar begot many boars, and that ram begat 12 sheep. When those 12 sheep had grown up, they handed over one of themselves to the wild asses, and those wild asses in turn handed that sheep over to the wolves, and that sheep grew up among the wolves. And the ram led forth the 11 sheep to dwell with it, and to pasture with it among the wolves. And they multiplied and became many flocks of sheep. And the wolves began to fear them and oppress them, until they did away with their young, and they cast their young into a river of much water. And those sheep began to cry out because of their young, and to make complaint to their Lord. And a sheep that had escaped safely from the wolves fled and went off to the wild asses. And I saw the sheep groaning and crying out and petitioning their Lord with all their might, until that Lord of the sheep descended from a lofty chamber at the voice of the sheep, and he came to them and saw them. And he summoned that sheep that had fled from the wolves, and he spoke to it about the wolves, that it should testify against them not to touch the sheep. And the sheep went to the wolves at the command of the Lord, and another sheep met that sheep and went with it. And the two of them went and entered together into the assembly of those wolves. And they spoke to them, and testified against them, that they should not henceforth touch the sheep. After this I saw the wolves, how they dealt more harshly with the sheep and all their might, and how the sheep cried out. And their Lord came to the sheep and began to strike the wolves. And the wolves began to lament, but the sheep were quiet, and thereafter they did not cry out. And I looked at the sheep until they went out from the wolves. And the wolves' eyes were blinded, and the wolves went out pursuing those sheep with all their might. And the Lord of the sheep went with them, leading them, and all his sheep followed him. And his face was dazzling and glorious and fearful to look at. And the wolves began to pursue those sheep until they met them by a swamp of water. And that swamp of water was split apart, and the water stood to one side and the other before them. And their Lord, as he led them, stood between them and the wolves. And as those wolves still did not see the sheep, they went into the midst of that swamp of water. The wolves pursued the sheep, and those wolves ran after them into that swamp of water. And when they saw the Lord of the sheep, they turned to flee from his presence. But that swamp of water flowed together and suddenly returned to its natural state, and the water swelled up and rose until it covered those wolves. And I saw until all the wolves that had pursued those sheep perished and sank. But the sheep departed from that water and went out to a desert, where there was no water or grass, and they began to open their eyes and see. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep was pasturing them and giving them water and grass, and that sheep was going and leading them. That sheep went up to the summit of a high rock, and the Lord of the sheep sent it to them. After that, I saw the Lord of the sheep who stood before them, and his appearance was majestic and fearful and mighty, and all those sheep saw him and were afraid before him. And all of them were afraid and trembling because of him, and they were crying out after that sheep with the other sheep that was in their midst, "We cannot stand before our Lord or look at him." And again, that sheep that led them went up to the summit of that rock, and the sheep began to be blinded and to stray from the path that it had shown them. But the sheep did not know about these things. And the Lord of the sheep was filled with great wrath against them, and that sheep discovered it, and went down from the summit of that rock, and came to the sheep, and found most of them blinded and straying. And when they saw it, they were afraid and trembled before it, and wished to return to their folds. And that sheep took other sheep with it, and went against those sheep that had strayed, and began to slaughter them. And the sheep were afraid of it. And that sheep returned all the straying flock to their folds. And I saw in this vision until that sheep became a man, and built a house for the Lord of the sheep, and made all the sheep stand in that house. And I saw until that sheep that had met that sheep that had led them fell asleep. And I saw until all the large sheep perished, and the little ones arose in their place, and they came to a pasture, and approached a river of water. And that sheep that had led them, that had become a man, was separated from them and fell asleep, and all the sheep searched for him and cried bitterly because of him. And I saw until they ceased crying for that sheep and crossed that stream of water, and 2 sheep arose that led them instead of those that had fallen asleep, and they led them. And I saw the sheep until they were entering a good place, and a pleasant and glorious land. And I saw those sheep until they were satisfied, and that house was in their midst in the pleasant land. And sometimes their eyes were opened, and sometimes they were blinded, until another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. And the dogs began to devour the sheep, and the wild boars and the foxes were devouring them, until the Lord of the sheep raised up a ram from among the sheep which led them. And this ram began to butt and pursue with its horns. And it hurled itself against the foxes, and after them against the wild boars, and it destroyed many wild boars, and after them it struck the dogs. And the sheep whose eyes were open saw the ram among the sheep, until it forsook its path and began to walk where there was no path. And the Lord of the sheep sent this sheep to another sheep to appoint it to be ram, to rule the sheep instead of the ram that had forsaken its way. And it went to it, and spoke with it secretly alone, and appointed it to be ram, and ruler, and leader of the sheep. And during all these things the dogs were oppressing the sheep. And the first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled before it. Then I looked at the first ram, until it fell before the dogs. And the second ram arose and led the sheep. And the sheep grew and multiplied, and all the dogs and foxes fled from it, and feared it. And that ram butted and killed all the beasts. And those beasts did not prevail again among the sheep, nor did they snatch anything at all away from them. And that ram begot many sheep, and it fell asleep. And a little sheep became ram instead of it, and it became ruler and leader over those sheep. And that house became large and broad, and a large and high tower was built upon that house for the Lord of the sheep. That house was low, but the tower was raised up and was high. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they spread a full table before him. And again I saw that those sheep strayed and went off in many paths, and abandoned that house of theirs. And the Lord of the sheep summoned some from among the sheep, and sent them to the sheep, and the sheep began to kill them. But one of them escaped safely and was not killed. It sprang away and cried out over the sheep, and they wished to kill it. But the Lord of the sheep saved it from the hands of the sheep, and brought it up to me, and made it dwell there. And many other sheep he sent to those sheep to testify and lament over them. After that, I saw when they abandoned the house of the Lord and his tower, they went astray in everything, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw that the Lord of the sheep worked much slaughter on them in their pastures, because those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. And he abandoned them into the hands of the lions and the leopards and the wolves and the hyenas, and into the hands of the foxes and to all the beasts. And those wild beasts began to tear those sheep in pieces. And I saw that he abandoned that house of theirs and their tower, and he threw them all into the hands of the lions, so that they might tear them in pieces and devour them, into the hands of all the beasts. And I began to cry out with all my might, and to call to the Lord of the sheep, and to show him concerning the sheep, because they were devoured by all the wild beasts. And he was silent, though he saw it, and he rejoiced, because they were devoured and swallowed up and carried off, and he abandoned them into the hands of all the beasts of fodder, as fodder. And he summoned 70 shepherds, and he left those sheep to them, that they might pasture them. And he said to the shepherds and their subordinates, Every one of you, from now on, shall pasture the sheep, and everything that I command you, do. I am handing them over to you, duly numbered, and I will tell you which of them are to be destroyed. Destroy them. And he handed those sheep over to them. And another one he summoned and said to him, Observe and see everything that the shepherds do against these sheep, for they will destroy more of them than I have commanded them. Every excess and destruction that is done by the shepherds write down. How many they destroy at my command, and how many they destroy on their own. Every destruction by each individual shepherd write down against them. And by number read them in my presence, how many they destroy, and how many they hand over to destruction, so that I may have this testimony against them, that I may know every deed of the shepherds, that I may measure them and see what they are doing, whether they are acting according to the command that I gave them or not. And do not let them know it, and do not show them or rebuke them, but write down every destruction by the shepherds one by one in his own time, and bring it all up to me. And I saw, until those shepherds were pasturing, each in his time, and they began to kill and destroy many more than they had been commanded, and they abandoned those sheep into the hands of the lions. And the lions and leopards devoured and swallowed up most of those sheep, and the wild boars devoured along with them, and they burnt down that tower and demolished that house. And I grieved exceedingly over that tower, and because that house of the sheep had been demolished. And from then on I was unable to see whether those sheep were going into that house. And the shepherds and their subordinates handed over those sheep to all the wild beasts to devour them. And each of them individually in his time was given over by number, and by number each of them handed over to his companion. In a book it was written how many of them he was destroying, and more than was prescribed for them each of them was killing and destroying. And I began to weep and lament because of those sheep. And thus in the vision I saw how that one who was writing down each one that was being destroyed by those shepherds every day, and how he was bringing up and spreading out and showing that whole book to the Lord of the sheep, everything that they had done, and everything that each one of them had taken away, and everything that they had handed over to destruction. And the book was read in the presence of the Lord of the sheep, and he took the book from his hand and read it, and set it down. And I saw until the shepherds were pasturing for 12 hours. And look, 3 of those sheep returned and came and entered and began to build all that had fallen down from that house. And the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they could not. And they began again to build as before, and they raised up that tower, and it was called the High Tower. And they began again to place a table before the tower, and all the bread on it was polluted and not pure. And besides all these things, the eyes of the sheep were blind, and they did not see, and their shepherds likewise. And they handed them over to the wild beasts for greater destruction, and they trampled the sheep with their feet and devoured them. And the Lord of the sheep remained silent until all the sheep were scattered over the field and were mixed with them, and they did not save them from the hand of the beasts. And this one who was writing the book brought it up and showed it and read it in the houses of the Lord of the sheep. And he interceded with them. He interceded with him in their behalf, and petitioned him in their behalf, showing him every deed of the shepherds. And he testified in his presence against all the shepherds. And he took the book and set it down by him, and went out. And I saw until the time when 35 shepherds had been pasturing in this manner, and they all completed their respective times like the first ones. And others received them into their hands to pasture them in their respective times, each shepherd in his time. After this, in my vision, I saw all the birds of heaven come, eagles and vultures and kites and ravens. And the eagles were leading all the birds, and they began to devour those sheep, and peck out their eyes, and devour their flesh. And the sheep cried out, because their flesh was being devoured by the birds. And I cried out and lamented in my sleep because of that shepherd who was pasturing the sheep. And I saw until those sheep were devoured by the dogs, and by the eagles, and by the kites. And they left them neither flesh nor skin nor sinew, until only their bones remained. And their bones fell on the earth, and the sheep became few. And I saw until the time that 23 shepherds had been pasturing, and they completed in their respective times 58 times. And look, lambs were born of those white sheep. And they began to open their eyes and to see, and to cry out to the sheep. But they did not listen to them, nor attend to their words. But they were extremely deaf, and their eyes were extremely and excessively blinded. And I saw in the vision that the ravens flew upon those lambs and seized one of those lambs, and dashed the sheep in pieces and devoured them. And I saw until horns came out on those lambs, and the ravens were casting down their horns. And I saw until a great horn sprouted on one of those sheep, and it looked on them, and their eyes were opened, and it cried out to the sheep, and the rams saw it, and they all ran to it. And besides this, all those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites were still tearing the sheep in pieces and flying upon them and devouring them. And the sheep were silent, but the rams lamented and cried out. And those ravens were struggling and fighting with it, and wished to do away with its horn, but they did not prevail against it. And I saw until the shepherds and the eagles and those vultures and the kites came, and they cried to the ravens to smash the horn of that ram, and they struggled and made war with it, and it was struggling with them, and cried out that its help might come. And I looked until that man came who wrote the names of the shepherds and brought them before the Lord of the sheep, and he helped it and showed it everything. His help came down to that ram. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep came upon them in wrath, and all that saw him fled, and all fell into darkness before him. And all the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered and brought with them all the wild beasts. And they all came together and helped one another smash the horn of that ram. And I looked at that man who wrote the book at the word of the Lord, until he opened the book of the destruction that those last 12 shepherds worked. And he showed before the Lord of the sheep that they had destroyed more than those before them. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep came to them, and took in his hand the staff of his wrath, and struck the earth, and the earth was split. And all the beasts and all the birds of heaven fell away from among those sheep, and sank in the earth, and it covered over them. And I saw until a large sword was given to those sheep, and the sheep went out against all the wild beasts to kill them. And all the beasts and the birds of heaven fled before them. And I saw until a throne was constructed in the pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep sat upon it. And he took all the sealed books, and opened those books before the Lord of the sheep. And the Lord summoned those first 7 white men, and he commanded them to bring before him, beginning with the first star that had preceded those stars, whose organs were like the organs of horses, and they brought all of them before him. And he said to the man who had been writing before him, who was one of those 7 white ones, he said to him, "Bring those 70 shepherds to whom I delivered the sheep, and who took and killed more than I commanded them. And look, I saw all of them bound, and they all stood before him, and judgment was exacted, first on the stars, and they were judged and found to be sinners, and they went to the place of judgment, and they threw them into an abyss. And it was full of fire, and it was burning, and it was full of pillars of fire. And those 70 shepherds were judged and found to be sinners, and they were thrown into that fiery abyss. And I saw at that time that an abyss like it was opened in the middle of the earth, which was full of fire. And they brought those blinded sheep, and they were all judged and found to be sinners, and they were thrown into that fiery abyss, and they burned. And that abyss was to the south of that house. And I saw those sheep burning, and their bones burning. And I stood up to see until that old house was folded up. And they removed all the pillars, and all the beams and ornaments of that house were folded up with it. And they removed it and put it in a place to the south of the land. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep brought a new house, larger and higher than the first one, and he erected it on the side of the first one that had been rolled up. And all its pillars were new, and its beams were new, and its ornaments were new, and larger than those of the first one, the old one that he had removed. And all the sheep were within it. And I saw all the sheep that remained, and all the animals on the earth, and all the birds of heaven were falling down and worshipping those sheep, and making petition to them, and obeying them in everything. After that, those 3 who were clothed in white, and who had taken hold of me by the hand, or by my hand, who had previously brought me up, with the hand of that ram also taking hold of me, set me down among those sheep before the judgment took place. And all those sheep were white, and their wool was thick and pure. And all that had been destroyed and dispersed by all the wild beasts and all the birds of heaven were gathered in that house. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced greatly, because they were all good and had returned to that house. And I saw until they laid down that sword that had been given to the sheep. They brought it back to his house, and sealed it up in the presence of the Lord. And all the sheep were enclosed in that house, but it did not contain them. And the eyes of all were opened, and they saw good things. And there was none among them that did not see. And I saw how that house was large and broad and very full. And I saw how a white bull was born, and its horns were large. And all the wild beasts and all the birds of heaven were afraid of it, and made petition to it continually. And I saw until all their species were changed, and they all became white cattle. And the first one became leader among them, and that leader was a large animal. And there were large black horns on its head. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it, and over all the cattle. And I slept among them and awoke, and I saw everything. And this is the vision that I saw while I slept. And I awoke and blessed the Lord of righteousness, and gave him glory. And after that I wept bitterly, and my tears did not cease until I could no longer endure it. But they were running down because of what I had seen. For everything will come to pass and be fulfilled, and every deed of humanity was shown to me in its order. That night I remembered the first dream. I wept because of it, and I was disturbed because I had seen the vision.